I called him because my hands were trembling and the airport Wi-Fi was mercifully terrible, and because hearing his voice, even the faint static of it, had been my talisman for the last 7 years. I wanted the ordinary steadiness. The way he said my name at dawn, the stupid private jokes, the sound that meant dinner would be hot when I finally crawled into a hotel room at 2 in the morning. But the voice that answered was clipped, distracted. And for the first time in a marriage that had been built on small courtesies and bigger silences, there was a crack I hadn't expected. Hey, flight going okay? I asked for an hour, and he gave me 3 minutes and a promise to call later. Then to stop the knot in my throat, because the airport lights blurred everything into a watercolor, I asked almost thoughtlessly, "Are you still on the couch?" And he said, "Yeah, fallen asleep watching something." And the way he said it made my mouth go dry because he never fell asleep on the couch anymore. He always made a point of turning the television off and going to bed on time, like a man with rituals. And something in his voice was wrong. Like someone answering a question they hadn't expected, like someone who didn't want to lie and couldn't tell the whole truth. I hung up with the polite lie that I'd be fine, climbed into the shuttle that smelled faintly of coffee and the sorrows of other people's goodbyes, and texted my sister the stupidest emoji because I couldn't think of anything else. By the time the taxi took me from the airport to the downtown hotel, I had convinced myself that fear was a misfired imagination. Airports make everyone anxious, I told myself. So did 10 hours of flight. So did being separated from routine. And when the door to my suite opened and the bed made itself ordinary and immaculate, I did what I always did, a small domestic ritual that would anchor me. I tossed my bag, I peeled off the travel clothes. I called him back precisely because the first call had felt unfinished. His phone went to voicemail. I left a voice message that tried to be breezy and fit. I fumbled through the drawer for the spare charger. Habit took over. Habit is a conspiracy to keep the familiar alive. And when my hand brushed against the plainness of his bedside table, something else brushed back. A black rectangle, the precise model my sister had been saving to buy for months, laying face up where my husband's paperback should have been. For a second, the air seemed to be replaced by cold glass. The sound of the bustling city outside the thin hotel window dulled. The minute felt like a page in a novel I wasn't reading but living. It was her wallpaper on the lock screen, the silly picture of her at 22 with that ridiculous cat hat she refused to acknowledge in family photos, perfect as if someone had set it there to say, "I'm here." My stomach did an old familiar flip, sick, then sharp, and I laughed, a sound that felt like breaking glass and a child's noise at once. There are easy explanations, I thought. Maybe she had stopped by while he and I were both out. Maybe she'd called and left it there by accident. Maybe it was a prank. The smallness of the possibilities did not soften the magnitude of the realization. I had arrived to find what I had not suspected existed in my house for years. I picked up the phone with no right to it and pressed the small home button because the home screen asked for a passcode, and we had passed codes around like confessions. Of course it was locked. Of course it bore a protective film with a hairline scratch that made the light shimmer. Of course none of the reasons I'd rehearsed were clean. I could have walked away. I could have folded the phone, slid it back where I'd found it, and called him with an even voice and asked, "Whose is this?" I did not. Instead, I did the opposite of what my rational brain demanded. I sat on the edge of the bed and I listened to the new gravity of my life. Calls drained into voicemail. His texts were brusque and then a pause and then an "on my way" that meant nothing in the face of the plain object in my hand. I texted my sister 3 words I did not trust. "Is this yours?" and watched the typing bubble crawl across my screen like some small truce. Her reply came quickly. "No, I left mine at work. Why? Are you okay?" I watched her craft each line as if she were a person trying not to be seen rustling through a closet. Somewhere in me a quieter terror beat. Maybe she knew and was protecting herself. Maybe she was the betrayer and simultaneously the victim. Maybe the betrayal was more than either of them. When he arrived, the air between us had already coagulated into a new architect. His keys clinked when he put them down on the hallway table, which used to be music. Now the clink sounded like verdict. He hid nothing and hid everything. The first words were excuses that masqueraded as explanations. It's not what you think. And I had rehearsed my life for this moment, and so I let him talk because I wanted to hear the exact contours of his denial, to find aroma and residue. And the story that spilled from his mouth at first was a shape I recognized. Rooms, late nights at work, drinks that expanded into conversations. A woman named Claire, not my sister, who was lonely and needed someone to talk to. And then the more edible truth that it had become physical one time, and it meant nothing, and I love you. Then he paused and watched me like I was a geologist examining the fissures in his honesty. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone at the wall. I wanted to fold into the small parts of myself I'd left under his pillow. Instead, I held the phone like evidence and said, because I needed to know if I had fallen asleep and woken inside a nightmare. Why is my sister's phone on our bed? He looked away. He did not say Claire's name again. He said, she's helping. He said it like a man trying to make himself mean something other than what he had become. The explanation that followed was thin. My sister had called him the night she thought she'd been followed home from a bar. He had been there. Things had happened in the dim that were meant to be protective or helpful or saving. The phone had been left when she left. The two things could be true at once, him saying she was helping me and her face on his lock screen. But the arithmetic of the heart does not allow equations to be neat. I looked at him and saw a man who couldn't define loyalty any longer. I looked at the phone and saw both of them in a new geometry. Sister as ally and antagonist, husband as presider and destroyer. The room thrummed with the electricity of everything I had trusted evaporating. What followed was not a... There was no climactic shout where I slung a wine bottle and a montage of shattered glass. There was an anatomy of grief that unspooled slow and delicate, a guillotine made of little daily betrayals. I did what I had been taught to do when the world rearranged itself under my feet. I collected facts. I read old messages with terrible polite curiosity. I found receipts and notes and the smell of perfume that was not mine. I did not become a stalker. I became a detective constrained by the law and by decorum. The cruelty of the discovery wasn't only in the act, but in the normality. Lovers who flirted for months in the margins of my life, agreements dissolved over dinners that I didn't attend, 1,000 polite infidelities that stayed small until they were no longer. But alongside the evidence, there were small acts that confused the archetype of villain. A text from my sister I found that said, "I didn't mean to break anything," and a video on his phone of the two of them laughing awkwardly in a photo booth like people who have something to hide, but also something to lose. Betrayal, I learned, does not speak one language. It speaks in many dialects: shame, need, loneliness, survival. I confronted them separately because people reveal different truth tints when alone. My husband cried in his office the slow, embarrassed way men sometimes do when the scaffolding of identity is being dismantled. Like a man watching the collapse of something for which he had paid in small, daily installments. My sister hammered the back door on my childhood home with sudden, raw anger. I didn't want this to happen. And in each confession there was a childlike plea for forgiveness that smelled like the same perfume of cowardice. It is easy to say you're hurt. It is harder to articulate that the hurt is an amputation. I alternated between a cold, strategic recalibration, opening a separate bank account, clerk visits to understand rights and liabilities, and a private, raging tenderness that wanted to punish them with every theatrical cruelty I could imagine. I wanted to humiliate. I wanted to make them feel like thieves. I wanted to rewrite history in public so the world would judge them with the ferocity my private grief deserved. But revenge is a story that often promises more than it delivers. The first idea, public exposure, was tempting. Publish pictures, reveal messages, stage a scandal where their social circles would taste the same sourness I'd swallowed. But I had children to think of if I had them, parents who trusted me, a career that would not necessarily survive spectacle. And revenge as spectacle is always two-edged. The avenger sometimes cuts the same hand she wields. So I chose a different arsenal. The paradoxical cruelty of self-restoration. The plan was slow, not cinematic. I started by reclaiming my own rhythms. I finished the manuscript I'd abandoned. I went back to the language I loved. I began running before sunrise because movement builds new territories in the body. And I started to answer my husband's calls with a calm so absolute it was insufferable. I did not scream. I built a life that refused to collapse, and in that refusal I crafted my revenge, quiet, dignified, and utterly devastating to the people who had thought me an easy thing to discard. I moved things in the house that were his to the garage with a bureaucratic precision that felt righteous. I changed our passwords and left him locked out of the small digital alcoves he had once taken for granted. When he begged for one more chance, I offered terms he did not like, counseling with a professional we both respected, full disclosure, no more secrets, and a probationary period that read like parole. He balked. My sister begged me to let her into my life again on terms that read like please to be let into the room after the murder had been cleaned and the police had left. The community watched a little, friends texted with tentative sympathy, colleagues offered platitudes, and somewhere in the background people picked sides because humans need to affiliate even when their choices are moral shortcuts. I let them watch me refuse to carry on the old script of shame. Revenge, I discovered, can be an art of subtraction. Where they expected me to unravel, I purged. I unfollowed public accounts that showcased their faces together. I sold the couch where this had unfolded to a thrift store in another state. The first Sunday without them as a unit, I went to the little bakery that our family had always avoided because of its stubborn charm and ordered a croissant, sat at the cafe window, and watched strangers move through their small, unbroken lives. Watching other people's ordinaries was balm. I wrote emails to them with the formal kindness of a will being rewritten. Short sentences that named the harm, stated the boundaries, and closed with I wish you both well. A friend called it elegant cruelty. I called it necessary maintenance. Months passed, and with each one I refined the cadence of my revenge into something sustainable. I dated in the way people buy flowers after a drought, tentative, curious, sometimes foolish. I never let the dates know anything about the scandal. This was not theater. I rebuilt trust in myself by learning to be small and fallible again. When my sister called asking for forgiveness, I answered with a kind of truth that was new to both of us. I forgive you for being human. I do not forgive the ways your choices made my life smaller. That distinction mattered. Forgiveness, I learned, is not a refund. It is an accounting. It does not remove the debt, but it allows you to move forward with the knowledge of what is owed. There were nights, forgive me, there were many nights, when the old rage returned and with it the instinct to disclose everything in a public gust of righteous damage. I would imagine myself on social media, declaring every text, every lie, every muffled apology in passive voice. I would imagine them with the light of exposure would be small and contrite, but rage is a lousy archetype. So I channeled it into creation. I turned the raw detail of my heartbreak into scenes, into sentences, into a half-formed novel about two sisters and a man who thought safety could be purchased in another person's silence. The writing was my weapon and my shield. It allowed me to transform humiliation into language, which changes the equation, because language is a map you can hand to others when you need them to navigate the jagged places. There was also a small mercy. The world does not always reward moral cleanliness. My husband fell into predictable patterns, shame, then bravado, then an attempt at normalcy that looked like defiance. The people he had confided in began to see him in new human dimensions. They did not all shun him. People are not binary. My sister, for her part, moved cities for a job that paid too little and required more hours than she liked. She called less. I do not savor suffering, but I notice that the scandal's shine dulled with time. It is an odd comfort to see what once burned bright be absorbed into the gray of ordinary life. One winter evening, a year after the phone on our bed, we sat across from one another at a mediation table because the legalities of disentanglement required formal mediation. I had on my sister's old scarf, an act I chose to disarm my own sense of theatrical revenge. And when my husband reached for his coffee, his hand trembled like it had on the night he confessed. We divided things not with the theatrical cruelty I had dreamed of, but with paperwork and signings and the slow, mechanical work of separating lives that had been intertwined for a decade. Signing a document is not dramatic, but it is permanent in a way shouting rarely is. He asked if I would ever remarry. I told him I had no forecast to give, and that my weather would be rented to no one for a while. He asked if I could ever be his friend again. I told him that some friendships are rendered into stories and that ours would be a story I might one day read without my throat closing. He did not like that answer. He had expected, like most people, one more invitation to return to what we. The final act, if there must be one, was not public humiliation or a thrill of payback. It was the steady, difficult unmaking of what we had all been so comfortable being. The revenge that satisfied me most was not the collapse of their social reputation, but the reclamation of my mornings and my name. I changed my email to a new address that did not include our shared surname. I asked for the photos of us together in albums to be posted in neutral boxes, mailed to an archival service that would preserve them in a memory I could one day choose to open or not. I planted a tree ridiculously symbolic and watched its winter branches hold on to the rain. I dated a man who never asked about the past unless I volunteered it, who accepted my caution as a trait of the person he was choosing to know. He was not a cure. He was a companion in the difficult art of being human after betrayal. There were moments of tenderness that complicated the neat geometry of revenge. Once at my mother's funeral, which our ruptured family still managed to hold with fumbling grace, my sister placed her hand over mine, and for a second our fingers fit like the missing note in a melody. No, I did not take her back in the way she had wanted. I did not let our story revert to the old template, but I allowed for a restricted reunion, holidays in separate homes, but with shared plates at certain dinners, because grief has room for more than one kind of wound. She cared for me in small, flawed ways afterward. She brought soup once when I had the flu, and I let her, because the soup was a literal nourishment that did not require a moral ledger. Revenge softened into a mutual guarded grace. Years later, when people asked me about the scandal in a way that felt like a curiosity rather than an interrogation, I would tell them differently depending on who asked. To some, I told a short, clipped version that spared them the ugly details. We separated. To others, strangers who liked to parse the architecture of mistakes, I told the longer story and watched their faces cycle through pity and confusion and a mild human horror. But mostly I told my story to myself at night when insomnia visited, and I found what surprised me most. The ache didn't vanish, but it lost its ability to command the whole of me. The revenge had worked not because it had hurt them in equal measure, but because it had restored me to the habit of choosing a life that belonged to me alive, not to the ruins of their choice. If you ask me now if I would have done anything differently, I would say yes and no. I would not have let the discovery twist me into someone crueler than circumstance deserved, but I would not have pretended the revelation was less lethal than it was. I would have allowed myself more grief and less performance, and I would have given myself the radical kindness of claiming a life that did not depend on anyone else's moral arithmetic. Revenge, in the end, tasted less like triumph and more like breakfast eaten in the quiet light of a kitchen that had once known other voices. It tasted like warmth that was mine to name. And if the story teaches anything, it is this. Betrayal severs more than trust. It severs the sense that the world owes you continuity. But the true revenge is the reclamation of continuity on your own terms, living a life that refuses to be defined by the fracture and instead builds, with stubborn, imperfect hands, something whole from the pieces.